Imagine you are the most powerful man on earth, the great king of the Persian Empire. A young, arrogant upstart from a kingdom you consider insignificant has invaded your lands. Now, through a stroke of luck, you have managed to march your colossal army behind him, cutting him off from his home, his supplies, and any hope of retreat. He is trapped. His small, weary army is caught in a pincer, with your forces in front and behind. Victory is not just likely, it is a certainty. This was the situation for King Darius III in 333 BCE. But the young upstart was Alexander the Great, and on the narrow coastal plain of Issus, certainty would be shattered by a display of tactical genius and terrifying audacity that would change the course of history. Following his stunning victory at the Granicus River, Alexander the Great had spent a year marching through Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities and consolidating his control. But this was merely the prelude. The true test lay ahead. The great king of Persia, Darius III, could no longer ignore the Macedonian threat. He mustered a grand imperial army, a force of immense size and power, drawn from the heart of his empire, and marched west to confront the young conqueror himself. Alexander, hearing of the approaching army, pushed his own forces east, seeking a decisive confrontation. The two greatest armies of the day were now on a collision course, marching blindly towards each other, each king determined to annihilate the other and claim ultimate supremacy. The initial movements were a masterclass in strategic maneuvering. Alexander had marched his army through a narrow mountain pass known as the Syrian Gates, securing his route into Syria. Meanwhile, Darius, advised by his generals, took a northern route, marching through a different pass called the Ammanic Gates. In a stunning turn of events, the two armies completely missed each other. Darius's massive force emerged from the mountains behind Alexander's army, capturing his rear base at the town of Issus and brutally torturing and killing the Macedonian sick and wounded who had been left there. For Darius, this was the perfect scenario. He now stood between Alexander and his supply lines back to Greece. The Macedonian army was trapped. Darius's advisors, including the experienced Greek mercenary Amyntas, begged him to wait. They argued that he should hold his position on the wide open plains where he was camped, ground that was perfect for his superior numbers and cavalry. There, he could simply wait for Alexander's starving army to be forced to attack him on his own terms. But Darius was overconfident. Flattered by his courtiers and eager for the glory of a personal victory, he ignored the sound advice. He believed Alexander was terrified and trying to flee. Convinced he could crush the Macedonians in a single decisive blow, he abandoned his advantageous position on the open plain and marched his army south, seeking to pin Alexander against the sea in the narrow coastal plain bordered by the Pinarus River. It was a catastrophic strategic blunder. When Alexander's scouts brought him the shocking news that Darius was now behind him, his men were gripped by fear. They were cut off, isolated deep in enemy territory. But Alexander was overjoyed. He saw the situation not as a trap for him, but as a gift from the gods. He famously declared, "The gods themselves are on our side, for they have put it into the mind of Darius to abandon the open plains and cram his great army into this narrow space." He knew the terrain would neutralize Persia's numbers and turn the battle into a brutal, head-to-head fight where the superior quality of his own soldiers would be the deciding factor. The battlefield was a narrow strip of land, barely a mile and a half wide, caught between the Amanus Mountains on one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other. Through the middle of this plain flowed the Pinarus River, its steep banks providing a natural defensive line. It was here that Darius deployed his massive army. He placed his best heavy infantry, the Greek mercenaries, in the center to hold the riverbank. His best cavalry was massed on his right along the coast, where the ground was flat and open. The rest of his vast force, tens of thousands of lighter infantry called Kardakis, were packed into the Persian left and center, extending up the foothills of the mountains. In front of the entire line, he placed a screen of archers and skirmishers. Darius himself took his position in the traditional place of the Persian kings, in the absolute center of the army, surrounded by his 10,000 elite royal bodyguards, the legendary immortals. From his magnificent war chariot, he was ready to command his seemingly invincible host to a glorious victory. Alexander, having turned his army around, marched to meet him. He deployed his own forces with meticulous care. On his left flank, facing the powerful Persian cavalry by the sea, he placed his Thessalian cavalry, commanded by his trusted general, Parmenion. He gave Parmenion one crucial order: hold your ground at all costs. The fate of the entire battle could depend on that flank not breaking. In the center, he placed the unbreakable heart of his army, the Macedonian Phalanx. These 6 divisions of heavily armored infantry, armed with their terrifying 18-foot sarissa pikes, formed a solid wall of steel points. On his right flank, extending towards the foothills, Alexander positioned his elite Hippaspists, his light infantry, and most importantly, the finest cavalry in the world, the Companion Cavalry, which he would lead personally. Seeing that the Persian line extended further than his own and threatened to envelop him from the mountains, Alexander made a final, brilliant adjustment. He held back a portion of his infantry and light cavalry at a 45-degree angle behind his right wing. This refused flank acted as a tactical hinge, ready to pivot and counter any Persian attempt to surround him. With his dispositions made, Alexander rode along the front of his army, inspiring his men with his presence, before taking his place at the head of the Companion Cavalry. The battle began on Alexander's right. He gave the order, and the companions began to advance, not straight ahead, but at an oblique angle, moving across the front of the Persian line. This diagonal advance was a classic Alexandrian tactic designed to probe for weakness and create confusion. The Persian infantry on the opposite foothills, seeing this flanking movement, charged down to intercept them, disrupting their own formation in the process. Alexander seized the moment. As the Persian left began to move, he saw his opening. He immediately wheeled the companions into their devastating wedge formation and led them in a thunderous charge, not at the infantry in the hills, but directly across the Pinarus River and into the flank of the Persian left center, where the Kardakis stood. The shock of the charge was overwhelming. The lightly armored Persian infantry, hit from an unexpected angle by the best heavy cavalry in the world, shattered and fled. While Alexander was achieving a stunning breakthrough on the right, the situation in the center was far more perilous. The Macedonian Phalanx, charging across the river, had its own disciplined formation disrupted by the steep, slippery riverbanks. As they struggled up the opposite side, they were met by Darius's best troops, the battle-hardened Greek mercenaries. A brutal, desperate struggle ensued in the center, a horrific shoving match of shield against shield and spear against spear. For a terrifying moment, the Macedonian phalanx began to buckle, but Alexander was not done. Having routed the Persian left, he did not pursue them. Instead, he demonstrated his incredible battlefield awareness and discipline. He rallied the companions and wheeled them around, leading them in a second, devastating charge. This time, he smashed into the flank of the Greek mercenaries who were pressing his own phalanx so hard. Attacked from the front by the pikes of the Phalanx, and now from the side by Alexander's cavalry, the mercenaries' line collapsed. With his left wing and his elite center now broken, Darius saw the battle turning against him. And then he saw the whirlwind of battle coming directly for him. Alexander, having broken the mercenaries, was now leading the companions in a third charge, aimed like a spear at one man, Darius himself. The sight of the fearsome young king, covered in the dust and blood of battle, charging straight for his chariot, was too much. The great king's nerve broke. He turned his magnificent chariot and fled the field in a panic. The flight of the king was the signal for a total collapse. The Persian army, seeing their leader abandon them, lost all will to fight. The entire force dissolved into a panicked mob, each man running for his own life, desperate to escape the narrow plain that had become a death trap. They were mercilessly hunted down by the victorious Macedonians. On the other flank, Parmenion's Thessalians, having held their ground against the powerful Persian cavalry, now launched their own counterattack, completing the rout. In his haste to escape, Darius abandoned everything. Left behind in the royal camp was his mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statira, his young son, and his daughters. They were now prisoners of the young king they had been told was a barbarian. Alexander, in one of his most famous acts, treated them not as captives, but with the utmost respect and honor. He assured them of their safety and royal status, a gesture of chivalry that stood in stark contrast to Darius, the king who had left them behind. The Battle of Issus was a staggering victory for Alexander. He had faced the grand army of the Persian Empire, led by the great king himself, and had utterly annihilated it. The casualties were immense. While the Macedonians may have lost only a few hundred men, tens of thousands of Persians lay dead. More importantly, Alexander now possessed the Persian royal family and a vast portion of the imperial treasury. The psychological impact of the victory was even greater than the military one. Darius was now a fugitive, a king who had twice fled from the battlefield, abandoning both his army and his family. His prestige was shattered. Alexander, meanwhile, was no longer just an invader. He was seen as a noble and magnanimous leader, the rightful victor. The path to the heart of the Persian Empire, to Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt, was now wide open. The balance of power in the ancient world had shifted irrevocably in a single afternoon. The Battle of Issus was a testament to Alexander's genius, his ability to read the terrain, his unwavering confidence, and his unparalleled skill as a cavalry commander. It was the day he defeated a king and proved himself an emperor in the making. If you were captivated by this story of tactical brilliance and high-stakes drama, please hit the like button and subscribe for more epic battles from history. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Darius's biggest mistake was his arrogance, or was Alexander simply unstoppable? Thanks for watching.